Welcome back to Washington Watch. I'm Tony Perkins, your host. So good to have you with us on this Thursday afternoon. The website, tonyperkins.com. Lots of resources available for you at tonyperkins.com. By the way, let me remind you, men in North Carolina and anywhere within driving distance, which if you left now, it could be anywhere. Next Friday, we will have on the 6th and 7th of May, I should say, we will have our Stand Courageous Men's Conference, High Point, North Carolina. To find out more, go to standcourageous.com. All right, as I mentioned earlier in the program today, I'm not in Washington, as you can see for those who are watching, but instead I'm in Plano, Texas for the Watchman on the Wall Pastors Briefing, which was at Prestonwood Baptist Church, and we're in their studios. We're grateful for them hosting us. This was a terrific event with dynamic speakers. We wanted to both minister to our pastors and to challenge them and challenge them to encourage believers to live out their faith boldly. And I'm joined now by two men familiar to Washington Watch, the Washington Watch audience. David Closson is the director of the Center for Biblical Worldview at the Family Research Council, and Joseph Backholm is senior fellow for Biblical Worldview at FRC, and he is my Friday host, so you're going to hear from him tomorrow. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me here on Washington Watch in Plano, Texas.
Good to be with you.
Where's your cowboy hat and boots?
Left them in the car.
Oh, you did?
Unfortunately, I did, yes.
I want to focus on, as I've been talking about through the program, some of the questions the pastors ask. I always like questions because I think that tells us where people are, what they want to know. And I'd rather focus on what they want to know rather than sometimes just what we want to tell them. What were some of the questions the pastors asked today?
Well, the one that sticks out to me, Tony, is a question about how do we act in a way so that we are not perceived as an activist church. I think that was the way that was framed. I've also heard this as we don't want to be seen as like a Republican church. Right. The worst smear that churches feel like they can have right now is we're an extension of the Republican Party. And so nobody wants to be perceived that way. And the question was, how do you do all these good things culturally? How do we influence the culture while avoiding that smear?
Right.
And I think the reality is the answer is you don't. You can't. Because you are in a war, and there are people who don't like what you're doing. They are going to characterize everything you do in the worst light possible. And that is just a shot that is fired in this war. And the only way to not take those shots is to retreat.
And that's what they want.
Yes, that's exactly right.
And so, David, we have a lot of pastors, not ones that were here, because they were coming, most of them, to be encouraged and to be with like-minded pastors. But there are some pastors, quite frankly, are standing on the sidelines.
Well, there are a lot of pastors, unfortunately, Tony. Thankfully, none of the pastors that came to this briefing, one of the reasons they were here is they wanted to get equipped. They wanted to hear from the FRC team. And I think part of it, maybe the impulse is good. Pastors, they see their job as teaching God's word, and they want to, preach and teach and spread the gospel, and that's it. But one of the things that I've been trying to encourage pastors all over the country is, the second great commandment is love your neighbor as yourself. And the way you love your neighbor, unfortunately now, it implicates all of these issues, abortion, religious liberty, sexuality. Those are not first and foremost political issues. They're biblical and theological issues that the Bible addresses.
Well, they've been that way since the beginning of mankind. But what we've seen in the last century, 3/4 of a century, we've seen politicians reach in and take these issues and say, well, no, these are political issues. You in the church can't speak to these. And then the cultural elites label pastors who speak to these as being politicized.
The truth is they are political issues in the sense that they are debated in a political environment. And I like to remind people that politics is not a slate of issues. Politics is a process, right? It's the process through which we as a community make decisions as opposed to shooting each other. And so it's a helpful process, but the fact that a process is debating abortion or marriage does not make it a quote unquote political issue.
But is there anything that's beyond the Bible speaking to it?
No, I don't think so. I think the Bible speaks to every issue. Now, does the Bible give, you have to have a 10% tax rate or a 6% tax? No, it doesn't give specific guidance like that. Should a bank robber get 2 years in jail or 3 years? It doesn't give prescriptions like that. But the principles that the Bible lays out, Tony, those affect all areas of life, including the abortion issue, religious liberty, but even just how we treat one another. And so the Bible really gives us a vision for all of life. And that's why 11 months ago, we started the Center for Biblical Worldview to help people realize that everything in life, the Bible has a word for that.
And so our goal is that we don't want the church to be co-opted for political purposes, but we want the truth that the church preaches to permeate every aspect of society. And I think that's God's plan.
I think that's exactly right. It's beginning with the question, what does God think about this? And as you know, as slaves to Christ, as Paul refers to it often, we are really, we don't get to think for ourselves. We don't get to have our own opinions. We conform our mind to the mind of Christ. And so the question is not, is this a political issue? Is this not a political issue? The question is, does God care? If God cares, I care.
So let's deal with that underlying issue, the fear of what others think about us as pastors, as Christian leaders, the fear that these pejorative terms would be used, like homophobic, hateful, bigoted. How do we deal with that?
I think what Joseph said on our panel, we were part of a panel earlier with our colleague Brent Kylan, and one of the things, Joseph, I think you said that was so helpful is we need to be willing to sacrifice our reputation. We need to not worry so much about what other people think about us. And this is what, John 15, John 16, some of the last words that Jesus shared with his disciples was that as they persecuted me, they're going to persecute you. Same thing that he taught his disciples at Caesarea Philippi when he told them that he was going to go to Jerusalem and suffer and die. What did he tell them? He said, if you're going to follow me, you have to be willing to take up your cross and follow me. Well, the call to take up your cross is the call to die. That's what it meant. Yeah, if Jesus was persecuted, we shouldn't expect anything less.
We overstepped that element of the cross. It's not some bling that we hang around our neck. It is an instrument of death.
Which is why that teaching in the first century would have been so shocking. I think, you read that passage, Jesus there at Caesarea Philippi, which is actually known as the gates of hell, when he actually gave that teaching. It would have been real shocking for the disciples to hear that. But they didn't hear that as a call to just, go have fun and make sure people like us. It really wasn't. That would have been shocking teaching to those first century Christians.
Well, in many ways, we are coming back to what the first century church was like in terms of a very hostile, and I'll use this term, it'll probably upset people, but a pagan culture. Yeah. That it was hostile to the truth, and the church had to rise up from that, operate in the midst of that, and as we know, literally turned the world upside down with it.
That's exactly right. And another thing about the first century church, Tony, is it was a polytheistic church. And they didn't object, honestly, to the fact that they worshiped Jesus, because there were all sorts of gods that everybody worshiped. What they objected to is that they said there's no king but Jesus. And they refused to worship Caesar as God. So they don't hate us because we are Christians. They hate us because of the gods we will not worship.
Well, because Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. Right. And I've always said, as believers, these are not our opinions. So it's not like we have to defend our opinions. If we follow Jesus, we have to believe what he said and embrace what he said. It's his word, not mine. And so we simply follow what he has taught us.
Right. And, some people maybe who are just tuning into some of the issues in our society, the most controversial issue actually, in my view, is not the life issue or issues of sexuality. It's the claims that the exclusivity of the gospel. Right. That's what Christians have been offensive for over 2,000 years. Because like you said, Joseph, we refuse to bow the knee to Caesar or to a pantheon of gods. The exclusivity of Jesus Christ, that's the message of the church. And that's going to bring persecution. It's going to bring those pejorative labels. And we need to, Christians can be offensive in their presentation. We want to guard against that. Yeah. But let's just preach the gospel and teach people, here's what God's word said, and let people say whatever they're going to say.
This is Washington Watch. And as I mentioned, we are coming to you from Plano, Texas at Prestonwood Baptist Church today. We had a Watchman on the Wall Pastors Conference here. David Closson and Joseph Backholm, my guest here in this final segment. I want to shift gears for just a little bit because this is a Texas-based issue that was actually brought up today in the pastors' conference. In fact, Dr. Graham brought this up. Baylor University, a Baptist university, I think, or I don't know how you want to characterize it. But a piece that came out in the university paper today, actually it was yesterday, talking about abortion and critical of Texas's pro-life law, basically saying, hey, abortion is a woman's issue. It's her body, hands off. Who are you guys in suits trying to tell a woman what to do? Now, I wouldn't be surprised if this was coming from the New York Times or this was coming from some Ivy League institution, but this is coming from Baylor University. What's going on?
So I did a little bit of digging right before the show, Tony, and it appears, this is the student paper that's published there on the campus of Baylor University. And I believe the writer, she's a current student at Baylor. So this was kind of an op-ed, her giving her opinion. And it's clear that the view she espouses is, Joseph and I were talking about this, just the personhood theory, the idea that it's not, it's up to a woman decision. The baby that's growing inside of her is not a full-born person until a certain point. Clearly a deviation of what Scripture teaches on the personhood of the unborn. The Bible from cover to cover, and as has been interpreted for 2,000 years, affirms the personhood of the unborn. All people born and unborn are made in God's image. But clearly, from the perspective of this author, she no longer, if she ever did, hold any understanding of what the Bible teaches on this issue.
Okay, but what does this say about our institutions of higher learning where many parents are sacrificing to send their kids to get a quote unquote Christian education?
Well, we don't know that this author may have gone into Baylor with hopefully went in with this pagan worldview and didn't learn it there, right? That's the hope. And in giant universities,
shouldn't it have been changed?
Well,
confronted with the truth?
Yeah, you'd think so. But what this is revealing is, this is the summary of this is my body, my choice, right? That's the argument that they make. And the Christian response to that is it's not your body. So it's not your choice. And that's really the conflict. It's a religious difference.
Well, as believers, we belong to Christ.
Right.
And we know that this is a separate life. We can go through the science of it to speak to that issue. But this idea that it has no effect upon the rest of society, the fact that we would devalue human life, I would argue, and I come at this as a former police officer who's been on the streets and seen the results of violence, that as we have dehumanized and we have devalued human life in the womb, we also devalue it on the street, in the classroom, and all across America.
Tony, one of the things that came up during the summit today was the fact that George Barna's research has showed that 39% of Americans affirm the statement that human life is sacred. And that, of course, has huge implications for the abortion issue, but it's got implications for every other issue as well. And we see the disrespect for human life in so many ways.
We're almost out of time. Joseph, you know what the clock means. But there's a project that you're working on. 20 seconds.
Yeah.
Tell us about it.
Because we're hearing more and more stories about students going to these Christian schools and maybe not coming out with a Christian education. Joseph and I are working right now on a tool. You learn about it at frc.org/worldview. That's going to give a grade and a report for every Christian school in America. We're going to rate them on, have they capitulated to the culture, or are they being faithful to Christian convictions and confessions? So you can see that in the next couple of months. frc.org/worldview email if you want to sign up to learn more about and get updates on that project.
So that's an ongoing project that'll be coming out in a few months. And parents, great resource for you to determine what schools are actually teaching the Bible and remaining true to the truth. Joseph, David, great to have you on the program. Great to have you here in Texas today.
Thanks so much,
Tony.
And you'll be back tomorrow.
I will be.
And I won't. Folks, thanks so much for joining us as well. Check out the website, tonyperkins.com. Lots of resources there for you. Until next time, I leave you once again with the encouraging words of the Apostle Paul, found in Ephesians 6, where he says, when you've done everything you can do, when you've prayed, when you've prepared, and when you've taken your stand, by all means, keep standing.